So welcome again to one and all. I'm really thrilled to be joining you for this next edition of Tipping Points. It's our 10th in a series, and we are looking forward to continuing conversations in Tipping Points about how we balance conservation and development needs, and how we explore options to become more sustainable as a species on this incredible landscape that we live upon. Today, we are being joined by a scientist and a journalist. And really, this session today is about how do we bridge that gap between science and the public, using the crucial and pivotal role that journalists can play. My name is Robert Inglis. I'm a science communicator. I've spent the past 20 years working in the intersection of science and society, working with researchers and research organizations, helping them to think about how to do their communications in powerful ways that can cause positive, powerful change. And I'm really passionate about facilitating dialogue between experts and the public. And this role of the science communicator is an interesting one. We often play an intermediary role between scientists and the public. But the role of the science journalist and the role of the scientist are quite interesting ones, because as a collective, they are essential components for getting science out into public spaces. And today we're just going to unpack that relationship a little bit and learn from two practicing professionals what they've learned in their time. Researchers and journalists have very different priorities. They have different sensitivities and rhythms, and quite often they don't speak the same language, quite literally. So what we're going to do today is try and work out how those two spaces can work together more seamlessly to get good science out into the public domain. We would welcome your contributions. So just to get you a little bit of information about how things are working today, the opening statements that we've asked each of our visitors to start with will give a little bit of a context for their world and the world in which they occupy. And we'll do that for about 5 or so minutes each, just to really give a sense of what it means to be a scientist and what it means to be a journalist. And then we've got a couple of questions that we've prepared in conversation with the panelists, and we'll run those question and answers up until about 1/2 the hour, perhaps a little bit beyond that, looking at about 1/2. And then we'd really like to hear your questions. We're hoping that there are scientists in this space. We're hoping there's science communicators. And ultimately, we're going to try and unpack some of the challenges and the tensions in this space and learn how we can work better together to get good science out into the world. So let me not take any more time. I'd like to introduce you to our first panelist. Or rather, let me give you the introduction first. I'm pleased to introduce our panelists for today. Elise Tempelhoff is an award-winning environmental journalist, and Dr. Nehemiah Latolla is a postdoctoral fellow in chemistry at Nelson Mandela University, where he's been working in phytochemistry of indigenous medicinal plants towards drug discovery for diabetes. He's also the winner of the International Fame Lab competition, and I'll give you a little bit more on that just now. So the first speaker that we'd like to welcome is Elise Tempelhoff. Elise Tempelhoff is an award-winning environmental journalist. She focuses mainly on environmental law, climate change, wildlife trade, water pollution, and environmental and human rights. She's won a number of awards. We can post some of this online, so I don't want to use up too much time, but a number of awards for her environmental journalism. And she's been part of a number of international conferences where she's talked about some of the challenges of communicating research, especially in particular on water-related issues. So I'd like to welcome Elise Tempelhoff. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I think it's very important that scientists and journalists communicate with one another. If I have to explain my industry is like a filter. I'm just communicating what is given to me. I question that. I have to be critical. I have to look at different sides of a story. Science research is very much part of my work, but I need the scientists to send me and tell me what they do and what they've done in such a way that it can be conveyed to. I always think to myself, it must be as easy as explaining something to a grade 10 pupil in school, so that I can understand it, because I can't write something that is not understandable. So I can't just copy and paste and say it comes from this and this scientist or just translate it. I have to understand it and change it into readable language. Now, I have unfortunately or fortunately, I write in Afrikaans, so I don't reach everybody, but sometimes I send my stories to someone, say, overseas, and then they Google translate it. Yes, and it works like this. I'm a freelance journalist, but it works like every minute is very important. So we work against time, and we have to go through huge research reports within a very, very short time. So sometimes I read the extract and the conclusion, and then I scan through the rest of because I have to write it. Because it's very time consuming. And yes, I actually work for print, but for beeld, for Volksblad and Die Burger, but Netwerk 24, and it's not News 24, take the stories and put it on the web. So sometimes everything should be like yesterday. I did a story and it's in today's paper, but I got an urgent notification from the Department of Water and Sanitation, asking the people below the Bloemhof Dam to evacuate, because the dam sluices were expanding and they were going to get let through more water. So they asked the people to evacuate. So it was no use for me to put it in my story that appears today. So I tweeted the notification. Or if it's on Netwerk 24, they would also put it on the internet immediately so that people can read it. Because that should have happened yesterday at 3 o'clock, at 15 hours. So, yes.
Can you tell us a little bit more about how print industry or newspaper industry generally works in terms of the time frames that you've got for putting stories together?
Yes, I have to, for instance, I start work in the morning, and then I start doing my research and reading and everything, and then my stories must be in we have a folder or a program, IDOS, and then I put it into IDOS, and then it goes through many, many hands.
Name a couple of those.
Of really? The hands.
The hands.
Yeah, okay. It goes to the night editor. The night editor distributes it to the subs, and the subs will go through it to see whether all the facts talk to one another and whether they are correct. They will also come back to me and ask, and then they will sometimes cut the story because it has to be put into a certain space in the newspaper, which is sometimes problematic for me. And then, yes, and then tomorrow morning it will be in the paper. So everything is then yesterday. Whereas, you understand what I mean?
Absolutely.
today, whereas on the internet, the web, it will be what is today. Today is Thursday. Then it would be Thursday or Wednesday.
Absolutely. And how do you decide what stories you're going to cover? How do you get a sense of?
There are, sometimes it's difficult to decide because there are so many environmental stories. It is just like torrents of stories, and we have to prioritize. Like at the moment, just before this webinar started, I had to go, log into the press club and to SA Weather, the SA Weather Services, because they are watching Freddie at the moment, the cyclone Freddie. So, and in the meantime, I also have to do climate change stories. And there was also, there are a lot of stories that lately, well, not lately, say the last 2 years, that civil society takes government to courts for decisions that they are not happy with. So yes. That is a story that I'm going to work with today. Yes.
And then just a little bit about how the industry has transformed or changed in the last decade. So I think we all have a sense of when we encountered media, but could you talk a little bit to how the media industry has shifted, and in particular the news media?
Yes. There was a dramatic change in that our editors and our managers decided stories must first be on the web. In other words, if something happens, or if I write something, I'm at a press conference, or the sluices, it's now very sort of actual, sluices at the Vaal Dam is going to be opened. I can't anymore say this 12 sluices were opened yesterday. I would say short notice saying the 12th sluice, or the 11th or the 12th sluice was opened 5 minutes ago. And then I would write a short story and send it to the web. And then I would work on that story and make a proper story with context, with comments and everything for the newspaper.
It's lovely to hear these.
It's very challenging. Sorry, can I just add something? I can remember I was at, and people who work in the environment will remember that. And that was very, I can't remember when it was. I think it was in 2016. I went to a funeral of a very good colleague of mine, Johan Botha. He used to work with 50/50 and he was murdered. And I can remember I sat with my computer in the service, and while the priest was still praying, I had to write a story. So, it's like very difficult, you have to do everything. And we got rid of our photographers. We have 2 photographers, and the journalists have to source photographs from other people, or they have to take their own photographs. So you have to be very, very sort of versatile, which is difficult. And many people.
And you're a specialist, sorry to cut across you, you're a specialist environmental writer. To what extent has that changed in newsrooms, where there are specialists and who's employed by newsrooms? Because I think you're a freelancer
yes,
and a specialist as a result.
Yes, we don't have specialists anymore, or they don't have specialists anymore. You have to do everything, which is problematic, because you have to, well, that's why I am now a freelance, because I can't do half a story about this and then half a story about this and then go back to the first story and do a little bit about that. And then tomorrow somebody else takes the story over. And I mean, so you can never go into depth, into deeper. Digging deeper is very, very problematic. And in my beat, You have to, know the background. You have to know South Africa. You have to know the geography, the climate, everything.
Yeah. So this thing of the I think the gutting of newsrooms, the extent to which specialist journalists are no longer part of newsrooms, but a number of people have had to take on freelance work. That's just all part of the context, and I think really quite useful for others to think about. So thanks very much, Elise. I'm going to hand over to Nehemiah. As I mentioned, Nehemiah is a working scientist. He works at Nelson Mandela University, and he's a postdoc research fellow in chemistry, looking at phytochemicals for drug delivery, for drug identification, in particular around diabetes. So Nehemiah, please welcome on board, and we'd love to hear a little bit about your context and the context you work into to give us some insight for this conversation. Thanks.
So good afternoon, Robert, and good afternoon to everyone else. I want to apologize in advance. I'm fighting a bit of a cold. So if I have a bit of a cough, please forgive me. I want to share a slide, if I may. I just want to share a slide that'll kind of guide my reflections with you this afternoon. I'm going to share a few personal reflections, and I want to hamper on the fact that they are personal. So they are mine. They might be different from other scientists who've engaged in similar experiences. So my reflections on science in the media are informed by my experiences as an early career academic, having been crowned recently the International FameLab winner, and through being a witness of science communication, especially at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. From the onset, it was very clear to me that how I was trained as a scientist to share my findings was not accessible to the public, nor was it compatible with the way in which the media disseminated research or stories. Science is usually a very complex endeavor, and we try to make meaning isolating and investigating small areas of the larger context. And I think that this is where the point of contention comes in. The media is interested in the context and not necessarily in our niches as scientists. So in other words, the media goes straight to the so what question. And this puts many scientists in a very tight position. It is so because it's in the way we are trained to disseminate our information. We are trained to take empirical findings and state them and quote unquote, to let the findings speak for themselves. Contrary to that, we are not pastors in a great crusade trying to save your soul from eternal damnation. No, we are simply communicating findings, hopefully without any bias or without any personal opinion. So as a researcher that is considered a basic scientist, then as a chemist, this becomes very difficult, or this has some implications, because we do know what the implication of our research is, right? But we are very careful of either overstating or overselling that implication. And the media is very concerned with what the implication is. So the what is the next big thing then becomes a hampering factor to my research as a basic scientist. I can put of stories I tell from my research and the expectation that the public will have. Of course, there's the opposite of this, that we have no problem stating the implication of our research when it comes to funding applications. So maybe we should sit back and think about that. So in essence, where science tries to better or contribute or comment on the human condition, the media comes in on an angle of where they are trying to tell the human story. And sometimes those things don't come together. particularly looking back at the science communication during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. A great deal of misinformation and disinformation was going around because either scientists were not telling the story or scientists were not being very effective in their communication of telling said story. You would have politicians citing articles, one article to make a brazen statement that this is the norm or this is what happens. And that is just not true. That's just not how science works. But who gets to be at the podium and who gets to be at the mic decides what story goes out or what is read or what is printed. So, and I think Elise raised an important thing that I wanted to touch on, the fact that there's also the sense of a journalist. She needs to interrogate the scientist. She needs to bring other opinions in, and sometimes that is a daunting experience for someone who's just starting out or someone who's just merely looking at a niche area when you are all of a sudden confronted by the causality of your research in society. So I guess to conclude my reflection, I want to say that as scientists, we need to learn to communicate our research more effectively, probably. There's a saying that I go by, that research worth pursuing is research worth sharing. And I think we need to pay into how do we communicate that more better and effectively to the public or greater publics with the message being received on the other side. But then I also think there's a lot of work that needs to be done between the media and the scientists to come to the middle of the table to find some trust with how we work through that. Because sometimes the science is not clickbait, or the science itself does not sell newspapers. And so another element comes in that sometimes misplaces the meaning of the science or forces the science to make statements that the results simply aren't ready to do. So I think trust is a key factor moving forward, and maybe a better ways of engaging ourselves, our scientists, better ways of using these platforms such as Twitter or Facebook to get our message and our story out there to the greater publics. So yeah, that's my reflection.
Yeah, Maya, thanks very much. Those are really interesting points to have created or entered into the discussion. I was interested in the one where you spoke a little bit about how sometimes there's an overstatement or an over expression of what is possible through science, and perhaps a mismatch there. I'm seeing quite a lot of mismatches. I think you haven't mentioned it, but I'm certainly familiar that, you know, scientific processes take years, 3 to 5 years, perhaps, for a particular study. Whereas, as we heard from Elise, sometimes she's got to get information out as it's happening, and there's that mismatch. But tell us a little bit more about this idea of expectations and expectations of science that come when you engage with media.
Yeah, definitely an expectation, maybe drawing from my own experience. I remember being asked in an interview after I won FameLab, the next night, the night of that event, I was interviewed in Newsroom Central in Nigeria, which presents to the whole of Africa. And I was asked, all of a sudden, put on the spot, that when will my drug be available? And so I quickly realized that whereas with us, we are interested in looking at a particular area of study and seeing what is possible, maybe there's a lack of understanding also on the part of the public that what really goes into our research, and maybe we need to bring that to the fore. For instance, many people before COVID-19 did not know that there was a trial, a clinical trials that needed to go beforehand before drugs get admitted. And even before those trials, there are pre-trials. And then after those, there are many other processes, and all of this involves money, which lends way to bureaucracy and all of that. But I think maybe we can do a better job about talking about the process. And I don't know if I lost the question somewhere in there.
No, not at all. And I'm also just interested in this idea of sort of the reluctance that scientists sometimes have to enter media spaces. So why are scientists concerned about self-promotion or being seen to be self-promoting? What's the issue there? Why do scientists sort of are reticent perhaps about putting themselves into public spaces?
I think maybe it's because of the nature of science, right? If you've heard my reflection, I use the words we, very passive language, and not the words I, because in essence, when I do my research, I'm not Nehemiah doing my research, but I form a part of a research team or a research unit, and I have a particular area that I am investigating or looking into. And so when you then look at that in the broader scale of things, your role seems very minute. So you do not want to overstate your role or overstate your presence and maybe step on someone's foot, or not even that, but also cause too much attention on you, because, you know, once things are online, once things are written, they are eternal and you can't retract that. And so I think that's why many scientists have become very cautious about overstating themselves. And I also think the more and more you advance, you realize that you really do not know a lot, that there is a lot more out there. And I think it brings with it a lot of humbleness. When you engage the research, you are reluctant to be boastful or to portray the research as something that it's not, because you know that it's so fickle that it could change tomorrow based on a small factor. And so I think the more you begin to know, the less reluctant you are to step out to make statements such as this is a cure or this will help and this, you know, so I think that maybe also might be some of the points there.
Absolutely. So thanks for raising all of those. I'm going to ask, just put a question to Elise, but while I do that, please drop some questions into the chat. I'm quite sure we've got a scientist, we've got a journalist. Try and understand a little bit better, or let's try and understand a little bit better how the dynamics in that space work. We certainly heard of a couple of tensions that exist. I'm going to put that question that's in the chat to you, Elise. How do you create real human connections in your writing about science? We've heard a little bit from Nehemiah about the extent to which the scientific process is kind of, we step away from the individual and it's more about the collective, and ultimately it's about stepping away and actually not interfering with the science, being a passive observer. How do we bring back a human connection when you do tell stories about science?
Nehemiah really put everything very well into context. I think the question is, how do I put, the thing is, why do scientists, why do they do science? Don't they do science to improve the human condition? Well, that's my question. And if something can change the human condition, to improve the human condition, you write stories about that. It's not about, you know, just science that's in a book and being put on a shelf. You have to write stories that will grab the imagination of your reader, and how he will ask, or she will ask, how will this affect me? I don't know if that is you know, I write a lot about mining and climate change because people can see what is happening at the moment. So the drugs that Nehemiah was talking about, you know, I mean, that would be my question too, if I had to put in, you know, have an interview with him, because that is the issue. He's researching a certain drug. So how will that help me to improve my life? I don't know whether that is answering your question. And then the other thing, sorry, not really.
Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say, because I am now, talking about Nehemiah's presentation, the trust between scientists and journalists are very important. So I think if I ask the question, why is this science important? Will it improve the human condition? Will it warn a certain, will it warn them to relocate, for instance? Like Durban, we had huge issues with Durban. Did people, as I'm not a science journalist as per se, I'm an environmental journalist. So why do people settle on some places where there will be mudslides if there is, for instance, this threat of storms and cyclones? So, and we look at how this affects people, the effect on people by certain scientific results. It's not easy. It's maybe I'm, sort of.
You can see that, and of course, when the floods. And when the floods hit, you need to be able to respond quickly from a news perspective. But the responses that might come from scientists around why, or researchers around why some of those things have taken place, need to potentially have taken a little bit longer to think through, and one needs to be very careful as scientists what you're saying about those.
Yes, and
go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say, because as Nehemiah said, that they don't want to be alarmist. He didn't use the word alarmist, but you don't want to be alarmist, so you use another word, for. So you do it sort of in a very cautious way. I always say, in Afrikaans is nou bewering, probably, I use words like probably, this could be, never a fact.
Absolutely.
Because it can change tomorrow, as he said. Everything can change very quickly.
I see a question from Fred. Now, I know that Fred's a journalist, so Fred's asking you from a journalist to another. Regarding climate change, a lot of stories have emerged over the last 2 years where civil society has taken government to court for inaction. Can you tell us what have been some of those most salient cases, test cases, and also give us a teaser on the story you're currently working on? Well,
I think civil society is just amazing in South Africa. I saw how civil society, I started with not with this beat, I started with general stuff. So at the moment, it's more climate change, as Fred said. It's like the threat of, I'm working a lot on Operation Pakisa, and yes, and energy. Energy is the huge thing at the moment, because there's a huge search for oil and gas in our oceans. And I can take you back to 2 years ago, when the issues about Shell and now Total, there are huge fights. And at the moment, I'm working on the Freddy, the cyclone. And we are watching watch the space for Total Energies, because they have lots of blocks around South Africa in our ocean where they want to drill, and the car power ships, and lots of corruption. There is a lot of alleged corruption.
Absolutely. So, I mean, also hearing that writing around real world issues is not only around writing about a particular scientific concept, an article that is going to satisfy public's need for information and to find out the direction of things is going to potentially draw on a number of scientists and a number of opinions. And I can imagine that that's a process that takes some time. You can't just drum that up in a morning. Perhaps, Elise, there's a good question here. What are some of the tips that you have, or that your experience, for helping scientists, and I've said it says interviewee, but helping scientists or researchers to open up and provide the information you require from them? What have been your experiences there? What is it helpful to receive from a researcher?
How do you mean helpful? Helpful. I think the very first thing is trust. And I get a lot of my stories from The Guardian. We were talking about The Guardian, is that they have a whole desk with environmental journalists. And I don't know how many science journalists they have, but they have a whole desk of, it is sometimes they publish stories and then they publish the report that it comes out from. So yes, the IPCC stuff, they let you know every time when there's something new coming on. So I just think it's trust. We have a couple of environment or climate change scientists in South Africa, but they're very quiet at the moment. I can't understand that. And they don't come out with, with their research. And then also I was thinking about the research. There's a research session, I think it's a week long, in Kruger every year or every 2 years. And we just get the notification there is going to be this conference. We are not allowed in there and we don't get the results. Whereas Kruger and any national park is very important to South Africans. So we need to know what's going on there. And we don't have time to drag it out of the scientists. Sometimes we don't even know who the scientists are who are working there.
Absolutely. So maybe I can put a question to Nehemiah, from your kind of knowledge and experience of how the science and the academic spaces are working. What sort of support is there for providing information to researchers? I'm sure if Elise is saying she doesn't know who the scientists are, I'm quite sure it's the case that most researchers don't know necessarily who the journalists are and how to make those approaches. Nehemiah, what is the, what support is available to you, and what might enhance your ability to get some of your stories into public spaces?
Well, like Elise says, she has challenges from that aspect or that angle. Similarly, from our side, we face the same challenges, particularly when you place the researcher in an institution. So the institution would have a marketing and communications center or department that decides what is newsworthy and what should get highlighted and what should get placed on certain platforms. And of course, the faculties have started to get their own in-house marketing spaces, which are usually interns or working in marketing for the faculty, that try to capture stories or try to capture things happening outside and linking researchers to particular journalists and such. But I think the most important tool or powerful tool for the researcher is the social media. Earlier on this week, I was asked by a journalist to comment on what I think about the decriminalization of MDMA, or the use of MDMA. I don't know if I have the acronym correct, MDMA, in the treatment of depression. And I stepped back and I was like, okay, I work with drugs, but not those drugs, So I had to step back and say that I think this is a wonderful initiative. I'm sure you can find someone in this field that can work in that, but I can't comment on that because I don't directly work with that. But I see there's this comment that you made, Robert, about the way in which not only one scientist can sometimes comment on a story. You need kind of these multiple perspectives. And now we get spaces where scientists becomes also opinion driven. There are some spaces where certain scientists will say, okay, I don't know much about that, but here's my opinion on the issue. And I think that's valid if you have, if you make it clear that it is your opinion and you don't have empirical findings to back that up. But I think experience also links certain people, because like myself, I work in a multidisciplinary team and we collaborate with other teams. So there's a lot I learned through our collaborations. And when you talk about transdisciplinarity in research, we directly work with communities to find solutions from business to science to humanities, feeding into those projects. I think then it really becomes a powerful thinking tank, and we start to break down those silos that we find ourselves in as scientists.
Absolutely. I've got a question or comment from Samantha in the chats. As a social ecological scientist, we also come from a space where knowledge is always incomplete because the systems we study are so complex. She says, research is the process of developing our understanding, and there's obviously a tension to communicate this as our understanding changes over time, which can cause skepticism for the public. And I think you've touched on that a little bit, but I think how do we work into a space where we can start to communicate that science is changing and that knowledge is changing all the time, when people actually want a little bit of certainty? They want to know what they can trust and what they can believe in. Any thoughts on that?
I think COVID-19 was a great teacher on that specific lesson. And I think we need to start to step out of the wanting to know everything and wanting finality, and realizing that because life is so complex, certain things are going to be true at certain points because of the information that we have. But as in the age of technology that we find ourselves, as systems of detection, as our methodologies of inquiry, as those change, when we get new information, we draw new conclusions. We come through different findings. And I think we need to become comfortable with uncertainty. We need to become comfortable with saying that at this point in time, we know this might change, but these are the precautions that we are taking now. You see, but when you put all of this into a sociological context and you put politics in there, it becomes different. It becomes a different beast. And all of a sudden now we need to know. And tomorrow, if what I say changes, then I am the devil, you know? So I think it's just trying, we need to get comfortable, and we as scientists need to be honest with publics that we don't know everything. Like the researchers said there in the question, that you study but a small section of a very complex system, and your findings might have implications on that system, but there might be other findings as well that slightly contradict or slightly negates that, and that's fine, because that's complexity. That's how complex systems work.
Absolutely. I've got a doctor friend who says we only know about half. We only know half of what is true. We just don't know which half is which. So it's always kind of making those guesses, or half of what we know is true. We just don't know which half. Elise, within that, how do we end up building that trust with scientists? I think we've got such a short time frame you're talking about. Can you talk to sort of your processes for making sure that we don't misquote or misrepresent or put something out that is true for a very particular context, but when taken in the broader context is not is perhaps misleading, through no ill intent on behalf of the journalist? Have you had any of those experiences, and how would you recommend handling those?
I think it's very important, as I said previously, and Nehemiah also said, trust is very important. And if somebody tells you, listen, this is off the record, then it is off the record. But off the record is usually to give you background. So you need background to the story, because you can write a story of 1,000 words or 1,200 words, which is an article in our terms, but the background is very important, and you have to work in that background without compromising your trust with the scientist.
And at a very practical...
there's always a disclaimer, or most of the time a disclaimer, more research is needed. So it's not, it's not the end of this research.
Absolutely. We've got about 10 minutes left in this conversation. And then we're going to open up the chat, or rather open up, we'll stop the recording, but we'll carry on talking if people have got more questions and perhaps more detailed questions that they'd like to explore. Elise, with that idea in mind, what is your process for checking when you are writing a story that you aren't misrepresenting? Do you give your interviewees the chance to have a look at the material? Is that a possibility? You certainly spoke about a number of people who work with the story after it has left your hands. I know a lot of scientists have had the experience that they said they felt like that they were misrepresented in the final piece, or that important context was left out. How do you try and mitigate some of that?
I will talk a lot and make sure, 100% sure. And if it's a very, very difficult story and I'm not sure, in that case, I will send it to the scientist. Otherwise, I will just make 100% sure that I didn't misquote this person. And that's why I said you have to understand what you are writing about. If you don't understand what you're writing about, you are definitely going to misquote somebody. And yes, but when we send stories to the author or to the scientist shouldn't change our semantics. Because that happens quite a lot.
Tell us a little bit more.
Yeah. So yes, I will send something if I'm not sure.
Okay. And often do you just, because of time pressures, you need to just proceed? You've got the quote, you've had the interview, you just proceed with the story as you have it without sending back if you feel.
Yeah, but I'm very cautious. I'm very, very cautious. And yeah, I know it sometimes happens that you are pressurized for time. But in this case, in environmental stories, if it's very, very immediate, if you have to write it immediately,
yes,
the science is now out that people are not reacting to antibiotics anymore.
Yes.
Or plastics are found or were found in breast milk. I think that's quite an important story, and it must go out as soon as possible.
Absolutely.
Most of the time, the stories can stand over a day, and you can make 100% sure that what you wrote is correct.
Fair enough.
And that way, you create trust. But like Nehemiah said, the scientists don't always know who to contact. Who is the journalist? So as an environmental journalist, you have to, and I don't like doing it, but you have to promote yourself. You have to get yourself known to people. And they must come to you. After years and years, 15 years, I've been working in this. People, say, okay, Elise is now the environmental journalist, we send her this thing. Otherwise, it just disappears in a big bin of stories or in a big email inbox.
Okay. Elise, I mean, I'm hearing that from both sides, on both sides of this divide, there is a bit of a brand building or an awareness raising that is needed. familiar with a new initiative called Quote This Woman to make sure that journalists have easy access, in particular to women academics, because of the lack of representation that continues by women in science in the media. But also there's this need for scientists to make it clear and put themselves out and say they're welcome to be contacted to give perspectives. Nehemiah was part of an international competition called FameLab. I'm really interested, Nehemiah, and I see Shabnaz is interested too. How has FameLab and other science communication experiences shaped the way in which you communicate your research?
It's made me very pedantic. Because immediately now, when I listen to someone or when I engage my science with people, I'm always very cautious of, do they understand it? Are they getting it? You know, am I using jargon? Am I doing that? So it's really opened me up to really look at how I communicate. And so I will now say that I have two ways of communicating. I have the way I communicate on pen and paper for articles, but when I speak, I become a science communicator in any room. If you want more detail, we can go there. But when I start to speak, that training kicks in, where I will eliminate jargon. I'll try and use metaphors or things to explain processes, try and make examples, and always try and draw it back to what does it mean? Start the conversation with what does it actually mean for you, you know?
Absolutely. Taking back that so what question.
Yes.
Just one more thought from my side is that before, and you mentioned it, Nehemiah, but before you can position yourself out there, you need to have a good sense of what conversations are taking place out there and what is in the public interest. So I think as a researcher, it's really crucial to be conscious of what opportunities might exist out in those spaces. And then from the journalistic side, I imagine it's a case of constantly looking out. Elise, when we were speaking earlier, you said that press officers at universities really had an important role that they could play or should be playing in making you aware of content. How would you say that needs to arrive to you? What are the kind of hallmarks of a story that you can immediately pick up and run with?
Robert, as you said, that the scientists must know what's going on in the world and what is like climate change. Unfortunately, it's now, it sounds like jargon, talking about the climate change, climate crisis and those things. But those are the issues that we have, and water shortages, water pollution. If there is anything in that space, then we need to communicate it to civil society. Civil society must know about this.
So finding out about those topical events and then trying to work out how your science talks into those spaces. So I'm going to bring it to a short end there. It's 2:00 and some people who've booked for an hour will be leaving shortly. But I would like to welcome you to stay on for a few moments afterwards. We're going to all be here for another half an hour if you would like to talk further. Just two quick upcoming opportunities. For scientists, we've got a researcher skills development program that has been offered by the Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation. So that's for scientists to be able to share their communication more effectively. So have a look on our social media channels. That's the Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation, OGRC. And if you're a scientist looking for how to communicate better to researchers, please do have a look at that and follow those links. And then there's a possibility that some of those articles that get written can be shared on the OGRC website. And of course, at any point, we've got a platform on the OGRC website for conversations about conservation and how it affects public and society. And then a second opportunity in the last dying minutes of this little episode is that we have an opportunity for a mentorship program roving reporters who is working with us to cover these webinars will help you to improve your journalistic writing skills, and we'll be using these Tipping Points webinars as a basis for the training. So please have a look on the Roving Reporters website and social media. This webinar will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, or rather the OGRC YouTube channel, and you can watch this and other webinars that have taken place prior to this one. We do this on a monthly basis towards the end of the month, so please keep an eye out for future successive Tipping Points episodes where we explore some of the ideas around how to communicate and get ideas about conservation into public spaces. So for those of you who would like to join us, please do for the next 20 or 30 minutes. And from us at Tipping Point, thank you very much for joining us, and we will look forward to seeing you again and engaging with you on social media, and of course through all the other opportunities that exist for such engagement. Thanks very much, and we'll end that episode right here.